This story is titled, Made Fun of My Husband at a Neighborhood Party, until he stood up and said, It's over forever. Hey everyone, the channel's been slowing down a bit, and I spend so much time finding these stories for you. If you enjoy the content, please hit that subscribe button. It means the world, and helps keep this journey going strong. Let's grow together. Now let's start the video. OP starts by saying, Hey Reddit, I'm using a throwaway because I don't want this connected to my main account. My name's Lisa, I'm 24, and my husband Jack is 26. We've been married for 3 years, but we've known each other since college. Honestly, I never thought I'd be in this situation. I screwed up, and now I'm paying for it. But I need to write this down because my head's spinning. Jack and I have always been different. He's the quiet, introverted type who's happy with a good book or a movie at home. I'm the total opposite. I love going out, hosting parties, and being surrounded by people. When we first got together, I thought it was perfect. He balanced me out, you know? He let me be the social butterfly while he stayed more in the background. But looking back, I didn't realize how much that dynamic was wearing him down. Jack's always been, I don't know the right word, accommodating, selfless, pushover. Hate saying that, but it's the truth. He always puts others before himself, especially me. Like, he'd get up at 6 a.m. just to bring me my favorite coffee because he knew I liked it fresh. If I was in a bad mood, he'd cancel his plans to stay home with me. He'd plan romantic dinners, surprise me with little gifts, and always made me feel like I was the most important person in the world. And me? I took it all for granted. I got used to it and stopped appreciating the things he did for me. I think it's because he never complained. Even when I'd slack off or get annoyed with him, he'd just smile and say, I love you, Lisa. It's like I convinced myself that he'd never leave, no matter how I acted. He loved me too much, right? I figured he'd just put up with it forever. Things really started to shift when I decided I wanted to be a stay-at-home wife. Yeah, we don't have kids or anything. I just didn't want to work anymore. Jack was making decent money, and I figured, why not? He didn't argue. He just said, if that makes you happy, we'll figure it out. Looking back, I can see how unfair that was. We were both young, just getting started in life, and I put all the financial pressure on him without even asking how he felt about it. At first, I kept the house clean and made dinner most nights, but that didn't last long. I got lazy. Jack would come home from work to a messy house, no dinner, and me sitting on the couch scrolling through my phone. He never complained. He'd just roll up his sleeves and start cleaning or cooking. He'd say he was tired, but he'd do it anyway because he wanted me to relax. And instead of feeling grateful, I started to resent him. It sounds so messed up when I say it now, but I wanted him to push back. I wanted him to tell me no, or stand up for himself. Instead, he just kept bending over backward for me, and I started seeing him as weak. I started to think maybe I needed someone more assertive, someone who could handle me, whatever that means. Around this time, I started going out more with friends. Jack would encourage me to have fun, even handing me extra money to cover drinks or whatever. He'd tell me to call him if I needed a ride, but he never went out with me. That wasn't his thing, and I was fine with that, or at least I thought I was. The more time I spent with my friends, the more I started to see Jack as boring. My friends didn't help either. They'd make little comments about how I deserved someone more exciting, someone who could keep up with me. The worst part? I started to believe them. One Friday night, I went out with my friend Tina for what was supposed to be a simple girls' dinner. It turned into bar hopping and dancing until 2 a.m. Jack had given me some extra cash, saying, Have fun, babe. You deserve it. I laughed it off at the time, but now it feels so pathetic. Anyway, that night I made fun of Jack for the first time in front of my friends. We were tipsy, and I joked about how he did everything for me, how he let me be a stay-at-home wife, even though we didn't have kids. Tina and the others ate it up, laughing and calling him a pushover. In that moment, I felt powerful, important, I don't know, but it felt good to have their attention, even if it was at Jack's expense. The next morning, Jack made me breakfast like he always did after my nights out. He asked how my night was, and I gave him a vague, one-word answer. I could tell he wanted to ask more, but he didn't. He just said, I'm glad you had fun, and kissed my forehead. I should have felt guilty. I did, for about 5 minutes. But then I brushed it off. Jack was fine, right? He didn't say anything, so it must not have bothered him. That's how I justified it to myself. Over the next few weeks, I went out more often. Tina and the others became my go-to group, and Jack started to feel more like a background character in my life. He'd still try to connect with me, asking about my day, planning date nights, but I'd always make an excuse or blow him off. Our conversations got shorter, and I could feel the distance growing between us. He looked tired all the time, but I ignored it. I figured he'd get over it, just like he always did. One night, I had a group of friends over for a movie night. Jack, being the saint he is, cooked us all dinner and then went to the bedroom to give us space. We were drinking wine, and the conversation turned to relationships. Tina joked about how her boyfriend could learn a thing or two from Jack. That turned into more jokes about how perfect Jack was, and how I had him trained. Fueled by the wine and the attention, I joined in. I made fun of his quirks, how he'd do anything I asked without hesitation, and even joked that I could probably tell him to jump off a cliff, and he'd ask how high. My friends were dying laughing, and I felt like the star of the show. I didn't think twice about it until the next morning. Jack didn't say anything about it, but the way he looked at me that morning broke my heart. He didn't seem angry, just defeated. He kissed me goodbye like always, but I could see the hurt in his eyes. For the first time, I felt a pang of guilt I couldn't shake, but instead of apologizing or even acknowledging it, I buried it. I convinced myself it wasn't a big deal. Jack would forgive me like always, right? Except this time, I think I pushed him too far. Things really started falling apart when I reconnected with some old college friends who had recently moved back to our area. I hadn't seen these people in years, and catching up with them felt like a breath of fresh air. They were loud, fun, and carefree. The kind of people who didn't seem tied down by boring routines. At the time, I thought I was missing out on something by staying home so much with Jack. Looking back, I see how stupid that was. The first time I went out with them, Jack was supportive like always. He handed me extra cash, told me to have fun, and even offered to pick me up if I needed a ride. I thought it was sweet, but at the same time, it made me roll my eyes. Like, why couldn't he come out and have fun with me? He always stayed home, doing his thing. I used to think it was just who he was, but being around my friends made me start comparing him to other guys who were more outgoing or exciting. It wasn't fair, but it's where my head was at. That first night out was the tipping point. We had a couple of drinks, and the conversation turned to relationships. Someone made a joke about their partner being lazy, and Tina, my closest friend in the group, turned to me and said, "Lisa, your guy's basically a housewife. Must be nice having someone who does everything for you." I should have defended Jack, but instead I laughed. I told them about how he always cooked, cleaned, and even encouraged me to stay home while he worked. Tina and the others were cracking up, saying I had Jack wrapped around my finger. One of them said, "Girl, you're living the dream. Why settle when you could have more?" I laughed along, but deep down, it planted a seed of doubt. When I got home that night, Jack had stayed up waiting for me. He asked how my night was, and I brushed him off with a quick, "It was fine." He didn't press, just smiled and said, "I'm glad you had fun." I could tell he wanted to connect, but I was too caught up in the excitement of my new social life to care. Instead of feeling grateful, I felt annoyed. Why couldn't he be more like the guys I saw at the bar? Confident, funny, and loud? Over the next few weeks, I started going out more. Every time, Jack would tell me to have fun and remind me to be safe. He'd even offer to drive me if I needed it. And every time, I'd mock him to my friends. At first, it was little jokes, like how he'd text me to make sure I was okay, or how he'd always remind me to drink water. But then it got meaner. I'd joke about how he'd let me stay home and do nothing, or how he'd never stand up to me. My friends would laugh, telling me I deserved better, and I'd soak it all up. At home, things were changing too. Jack didn't complain, but he started pulling back. He'd go straight to bed after work, saying he was tired, and we barely talked anymore. He still cooked dinner and cleaned up after me, but there was this distance between us. I should have seen it as a red flag, but instead, I got frustrated. I convinced myself that he was being passive-aggressive, that he was sulking because I was finally living my life. One night, I invited Tina and some other friends over for a movie night. Jack, being the guy he is, made dinner for everyone and even set up the living room with snacks and blankets. Once we were settled, he quietly disappeared into the bedroom to give us space. For a while, we just watched movies and had a good time. But after a couple of glasses of wine, the conversation shifted to relationships again. Tina started talking about her boyfriend, saying how she wished he'd put in half the effort Jack did. Then someone else said, "Lisa's got it made. Jack's like the perfect husband, right?" And instead of agreeing or saying something nice, I started making fun of him. I joked about how he was too perfect, how he'd do anything I asked without question. I even said, if I told Jack to jump off a cliff, he'd probably ask how high. Everyone was laughing, and for a moment, I felt on top of the world. I didn't realize Jack could hear us until the next morning. When I woke up, he was already dressed for work. He didn't say anything about the night before, but there was this look in his eyes, like he was holding back tears. He kissed my forehead like always, told me he loved me, and left. I should have apologized right then and there, but instead, I buried the guilt. I told myself it didn't matter. Jack loved me, and he'd forgive me like he always did. But things didn't go back to normal. Jack started working longer hours, and when he was home, he barely spoke to me. He still did everything he always did. Cooked, cleaned, took care of things around the house. But there was this quiet tension. It's like he was still trying, but his heart wasn't in it anymore. I ignored it, thinking it was just a phase. I didn't realize how much damage I'd already done. Around this time, I started noticing a shift in how our friends treated Jack. At first, it was subtle. Little jokes here and there about how he was whipped or too accommodating. But over time, they stopped taking him seriously. They'd roll their eyes when he spoke or interrupt him in conversations. And instead of defending him, I joined in. I laughed when they made jokes about him, even added my own comments. I thought Jack didn't notice, but he did. I could see it in the way he'd smile at their jokes, even though his eyes told a different story. He'd laugh along, saying things like, "As long as Lisa's happy, I'm happy." But there was this flicker of pain he couldn't hide. I should have stopped it. I should have told our friends to show him some respect, but I didn't. The worst part is, Jack's few remaining friends started pulling away too. They'd tell him he deserved better, that he needed to stand up for himself, but he'd always defend me. "Lisa's just going through a phase," he'd say. "She doesn't mean it." I think that was the beginning of the end for us. The more Jack defended me, the weaker I thought he looked. And the weaker he looked, the less respect I had for him. It became this toxic cycle. Me pulling away, him trying harder, and both of us pretending everything was fine. I started spending more time with Tina and her group. They encouraged my behavior, telling me I could do better than Jack, that I was settling, and I believed them. Jack, on the other hand, kept shrinking into himself. He focused more on work, avoided social events, and gave me even more space. I thought it was what I wanted, but instead, it made me resent him even more. Looking back, I can see how unfair I was to Jack. He was doing everything he could to hold us together, and I was too selfish to see it. I let my insecurities and need for validation ruin the one good thing I had. But at the time, I didn't care. I thought Jack would always be there, no matter what. I thought he loved me too much to ever leave. I was wrong. The breaking point came on what should have been just another neighborhood barbecue. Jack and I had been invited to our neighbor's house for one of their regular get-togethers. These parties were common in our tight-knit community, and while Jack wasn't the most social guy, he always made an effort. He'd usually handle the grill, make sure everyone had what they needed, and stay on the sidelines while I mingled with our friends. This time wasn't any different. At least, not at first. It was a sunny day, and everyone seemed in good spirits. Jack was helping at the grill, making burgers and hot dogs while chatting with a few of the guys. I barely noticed him. I was too busy hanging out with Tina and our group, sipping on drinks and catching up. The party was lively, and as always, the conversation drifted to relationships. One of the women in the group started complaining about her husband not helping around the house, and someone else chimed in about how their partner never planned dates or paid attention to them. Then, as if on cue, all eyes turned to me. "Lisa, you're so lucky," Tina said with a laugh. "Jack's basically the perfect husband, right? He does everything for you." I should have smiled and agreed. I should have said something kind about him. But instead, I felt the need to one-up the conversation. "Oh, trust me," I said, laughing. "Jack's great, but sometimes it's like he's too perfect, you know? Like, he never says no to me. It's almost annoying." The group laughed, and Tina pushed me further. "Seriously, what's it like to have a guy who just does whatever you want? You must feel like a queen." I leaned into it. "I mean, yeah, I guess. He's so accommodating, it's kind of funny. I could probably tell him to jump off a cliff, and he'd just ask how high." The table erupted in laughter, and I felt that familiar rush of attention. It was like a high, being the center of the joke, the one everyone was laughing with. But then I noticed the silence. I looked up, and there was Jack, standing just a few feet away. His face was pale, his jaw tight, and his eyes, I can't even describe the look in his eyes. It wasn't anger. It was something worse, like he'd just been gutted. "Lisa," he said, his voice steady but cold. "Can we talk? Now." The laughter at the table stopped immediately, and everyone turned to look at us. I froze, not sure what to say. Sure," I muttered, setting down my drink and standing up. I followed him to a quieter corner of the yard, aware of the stairs behind us. "What's going on?" I asked, trying to sound casual, but my heart was racing. Jack didn't look like himself. He looked done. He took a deep breath and said, "I can't do this anymore." At first, I thought he was joking. "Do what?" I asked, forcing a nervous laugh, but he didn't smile. He didn't even flinch. "I can't keep pretending everything's okay," he said, his voice breaking slightly. "I've tried, Lisa. I've tried so hard to make this work, But I can't keep being the punchline of your jokes. I can't keep being disrespected by you, by your friends, by everyone. My stomach dropped. Jack, what are you talking about? It was just a joke. You're overreacting. He shook his head. It's not just this one thing, Lisa. It's everything. The way you treat me. The way your friends treat me because of the way you talk about me. I've been trying to hold on because I love you, but I can't do this anymore. I deserve better than this. I stared at him, stunned. Jack had never talked to me like this before. He was always calm, always forgiving. It felt like he had suddenly transformed into a completely different person, someone I didn't recognize. You're just mad, I said, trying to brush it off. Let's go home and talk about this later. No, he said firmly. We're not going home together. I'm done, Lisa. When you get home, your things will be on the porch. I want you out. I felt like the ground had been pulled out from under me. Jack, stop! You don't mean that. He met my eyes, and for the first time, I realized he wasn't bluffing. Yes, I do, he said. I've made up my mind. And with that, he walked away. I stood there, frozen, as he returned to the grill like nothing had happened. The party continued around me, but I could feel everyone's eyes on me. They didn't know exactly what had been said, but it was obvious something had just gone very, very wrong. I wanted to cry, to scream, to make him take it back, but I couldn't move. Eventually, I grabbed my purse and left the party, walking home in a daze. When I got there, I found Jack already packing my things into boxes. I tried to talk to him, to apologize, to explain, but he wouldn't even look at me. Please, Jack, I begged, tears streaming down my face. I'm sorry. I'll fix this. Just give me another chance. He didn't stop packing. It's too late, Lisa, he said quietly. I've been giving you chances for years, and you've thrown every one of them away. I'm done. When he finished packing, he carried the boxes to the porch and set them down. Then he turned to me and said, You need to leave. If you don't, I'll call the police. I stared at him, hoping he'd change his mind, but his expression didn't budge. I had no choice but to leave. As I walked away, carrying what I could, I felt completely humiliated. I could see our neighbors peeking out of their windows, watching the drama unfold. Even Tina, who had been my closest friend, didn't say a word to me. I ended up at a park down the street, sitting on a bench and crying until my dad came to pick me up. I told him what had happened, though I left out the part about how badly I'd treated Jack. He was disappointed, but he took me back to my parents' house. And now I'm here, trying to figure out what the hell to do next. Jack won't answer my calls or texts. I've reached out to Tina and the others, but no one's responded. I feel like I've lost everything. My husband, my home, even my friends. And the worst part is, I know I did this to myself. After Jack kicked me out, I spent the first couple of days in shock. I mean, I knew I had messed up, but I didn't think it would ever come to this. Jack had always been so patient, so forgiving. I thought no matter what I did, he'd always stick around. That was my first mistake, assuming his love had no limits. When I got to my parents' house, they didn't say much at first. My dad could tell something serious had happened, but I only gave him a half-baked explanation like, Jack's upset and we're taking a break. I didn't want to admit the full story, that I had publicly humiliated my husband over and over until he finally snapped. My mom didn't push for details, but I could tell by the way she looked at me that she wasn't buying my version of things. The silence from Jack was unbearable. I called him at least a dozen times, left voicemail after voicemail, and sent text after text. He didn't respond to any of it. The man who used to text me good morning every single day and send cute little updates throughout his workday was now ignoring me completely. That hurt more than anything, because I realized it wasn't just anger, it was indifference. He was done, and nothing I said was going to change that. Even worse, the people I considered my friends, the ones who had encouraged me to act this way, went radio silent too. Not a single text or call from Tina or anyone else in our group. It hit me like a brick. These people were never really my friends. They loved the drama, the gossip, and the jokes when they were at Jack's expense. But now that things had blown up, they didn't want anything to do with me. A couple of days after the neighborhood party, I decided to go back to our house. I told myself I just wanted to grab a few things I might have forgotten, but deep down, I was hoping to see Jack. I thought maybe if I showed up in person, he'd at least let me explain. But when I got there, he wasn't home. The locks had already been changed, and there was a small box on the porch with a note taped to it. The note read, Lisa, this is the last of your stuff. Please don't come back here again. I've already started the process of filing for divorce. I'll send you the papers soon. Jack. I stood there, holding that note, and felt my heart shatter all over again. Divorce? He was serious? Knew things were bad, but I thought we'd at least try to work through it. I sat on the steps for what felt like forever, just staring at the box. It was like my entire life had been packed into one small container, and that's all I had left. When I got back to my parents' house, my mom finally cornered me. "Lisa," she said, "this break doesn't sound like a break. What really happened?" I broke down and told her everything. The jokes, the comments, the way I treated Jack in front of my friends. I even admitted how I'd been mocking him for months. My mom listened, but when I finished, she didn't try to sugarcoat it. "Lisa, I'm not going to lie to you. What you did was awful. Jack has every right to be upset." Hearing that from her stung, but I knew she was right. I started crying again, saying I didn't know why I acted the way I did, why I pushed him so far. My mom sighed and said, "Maybe you didn't think he'd ever leave. But Lisa, love isn't infinite. Even the kindest people have their breaking points." My dad, who had been listening quietly, finally spoke up. "You need to stop making excuses and figure out how to move forward. You can't change the past, but you can decide who you want to be from here on out." It wasn't the comforting pep talk I wanted, but it was what I needed to hear. The days dragged on, and my calls to Jack went unanswered. I started checking social media, desperate to get some glimpse into his life. That's when I noticed something that made my stomach drop. Jack looked happy. A neighbor had posted photos from the party, and there he was, smiling and laughing with people after I'd left. I hadn't seen that kind of smile from him in years. It was like a punch to the gut. While I was crying at my parents' house, Jack was moving on. I also started hearing whispers from people in the neighborhood. Apparently, word had spread about the scene at the barbecue, and everyone knew why Jack had ended things. A friend of a friend told me that some of the other wives were proud of Jack for standing up for himself. One woman even said, "It's about time he stopped letting her walk all over him." It felt like everyone was on his side. And honestly, I couldn't blame them. I was the villain in this story, and everyone knew it. One day, I ran into one of the neighbors at the grocery store. Someone I didn't know very well because Tina didn't like her. She approached me cautiously, like she wasn't sure if she should say anything. Finally, she said, "Lisa, I heard about what happened. I just wanted to say, I hope you're doing okay." I was so shocked by her kindness that I nearly started crying right there in the aisle. We ended up talking for a while, and she told me something I didn't expect. "You know," she said, "a lot of your friends have been trying to get close to Jack now that you're out of the picture. It's disgusting, honestly." Hearing that made my blood boil. These so-called friends, the ones who had encouraged me to treat Jack like dirt, were now going after him? I felt betrayed all over again. But at the same time, it just confirmed what I already knew. They were never really my friends. They were just users. The kind of people who thrive on drama and don't care who they hurt in the process. That night, I blocked Tina and everyone else from my social media. I didn't want to see or hear anything about them ever again. If Jack was smart, he'd keep his distance too. At this point, I realized I had hit rock bottom. I didn't have my husband, my home, or my friends. All I had was the mess I had made, and I had to figure out how to clean it up. For the first time in years, I thought about what Jack must have felt all those nights I ignored him, mocked him, or dismissed his efforts. It was a heavy realization, and it crushed me. I didn't know how to fix things with Jack, or even if I could, but I knew one thing for sure. I had to fix myself first. After the fallout from the neighborhood party and Jack's final decision to leave, I had no choice but to confront my reality. My husband was gone. My so-called friends had vanished, and I was back living with my parents like I was 18 again. It felt like I'd lost everything I had spent years building. But the hardest part wasn't the loss. It was the realization that I had caused it all. Jack's silence was deafening. Days turned into weeks, and he still wouldn't answer my calls or texts. I tried writing him letters, apologizing, and explaining how I wanted to change, but I couldn't even bring myself to send them. What could I say that he hadn't already heard before? Every time I picked up my phone, I imagined him seeing my name on the screen and feeling nothing but disgust. One day, the divorce papers showed up at my parents' house. My hands shook as I opened the envelope. Jack had written a simple note. "I've included everything you'll need. Please don't contact me again unless it's through a lawyer." I sat there staring at the papers, feeling the finality of it hit me. Jack wasn't angry anymore. He wasn't hurt. He was done. And there was nothing I could do to change that. I signed the papers a few days later, but it felt like I was signing away more than just our marriage. I was signing away the part of my life where I knew unconditional love, stability, and forgiveness. Jack had always been my safety net, and now I had to stand on my own for the first time in years. My parents, while supportive, didn't coddle me. My dad kept pushing me to find a job, saying, You can't sit here forever, Lisa. You've got to start over. But the idea of starting over was terrifying. I hadn't worked in years, and the thought of going back into the job market felt impossible. I had no confidence, no skills to brag about, and no idea where to start. Still, I knew I couldn't keep living in limbo. I started applying for jobs. Anything and everything. Retail, office work, even some restaurant gigs. I got a few interviews, but nothing panned out at first. It was humiliating, sitting across from hiring managers who could tell I'd been out of the workforce for too long. Every rejection felt like another reminder of how far I'd fallen. Eventually, my dad pulled some strings and got me a part-time job at a local grocery store. It wasn't glamorous, and I hated every second of it, but I needed the money. Standing at the register for hours, scanning groceries, and making small talk with customers gave me a lot of time to think about how I ended up here. I'd go home exhausted, but at least I was doing something. It wasn't much, but it was a start. One day, a customer recognized me. It was one of our old neighbors, someone who had been at the infamous barbecue. She gave me a sympathetic smile and said, "Lisa, I heard about you and Jack. I hope you're doing okay." I wanted to crawl under the counter, but I forced a smile and said, "I'm getting by. Thanks." Then she said something that stopped me cold. "Jack seems to be doing really well. I ran into him last week, and he looked happier than I've ever seen him. Happier." That word stayed with me for days. Jack was happier without me. While I was standing at a cash register trying to piece my life back together, he was out there thriving. It wasn't jealousy, it was shame. I had spent so much time tearing him down, and now that he was free from me, he was finally able to be the person he deserved to be. The neighbor mentioned something else too. You know, a lot of the women in the neighborhood are trying to get close to him now. It's kind of gross, honestly. That part didn't surprise me. Tina and the others had always acted like vultures, circling around anything they thought they could take, but hearing it out loud still made my stomach turn. These were the same women who had laughed with me, mocked Jack with me, and encouraged me to treat him like dirt. Now they were chasing after him. I wanted to reach out to Jack and warn him, tell him not to fall for their fake charm, but I knew it wasn't my place anymore. Jack wasn't my husband. He wasn't even my friend. He was someone I had lost the right to care for. After weeks of spiraling, my mom suggested therapy. At first, I resisted. "What's the point?" I said. "I know what I did wrong. Talking about it isn't going to change anything." But my mom wouldn't let it go. "Lisa, you've been stuck in your own head for too long. You need someone to help you sort through this." I finally caved and started seeing a therapist. Those sessions were brutal. Talking about the way I had treated Jack forced me to confront parts of myself I didn't want to acknowledge. I realized that a lot of my behavior came from insecurity. I had this need to be the center of attention, to feel like I was in control. And I took it out on the one person who loved me unconditionally. The therapist helped me see that I wasn't just grieving the loss of Jack. I was grieving the person I thought I was. For years, I had convinced myself that I was this confident, fun, independent woman. But the truth was, I had leaned on Jack for everything. Without him, I felt like nothing. Therapy didn't fix everything overnight, but it gave me a starting point. I began setting small goals for myself, saving money from my grocery store job, cooking meals for my parents as a way to show my gratitude, and even signing up for a few online courses to brush up on my skills. It wasn't much, but it was progress. I stopped trying to contact Jack. Every time I picked up my phone, I reminded myself that I needed to respect his boundaries. He deserved peace, and chasing after him wouldn't do either of us any good. Instead, I focused on rebuilding my life, one tiny step at a time. One evening, while scrolling through social media, I saw a post from that same neighbor who had come through my checkout line. She had posted a photo of Jack at a charity event, smiling and surrounded by people. He looked good, healthy, confident, and at ease. It hurt to see him so happy without me, but it also gave me a strange sense of closure. Jack was going to be okay, and maybe someday, I would be too. It's been months now since the divorce was finalized. I'm still living with my parents, but I've started saving up to get my own place. My job isn't glamorous, but it's helping me rebuild. Therapy has been a lifeline, helping me understand my mistakes and teaching me how to be better. I know I'll never get Jack back, and I've made peace with that. He deserves happiness, and I wasn't the partner he needed, but I'm learning to forgive myself too. I can't undo the past, but I can make sure I never repeat those mistakes again. To anyone reading this, don't take the people you love for granted. Don't assume their patience is infinite. Love is a two-way street, and if you don't treat it with respect, you'll lose it. Trust me, I learned that the hard way.